This this comes out of a conference in Frankfurt, I think about 2 years ago, and where I first met Scott and SJ. And this piece is in conversation with that conference, and it's been written up, and so it may be slightly stiff because it's more in written prose than speaking prose. So apologies for that. Okay. And I believe it's 40 minutes, so it shouldn't go further. One challenge for the study of zombie figuration is how to navigate between a contemporary cultural studies on the globalized use of the zombie, often in public performances or graphic and televisual media, a little bit more so than printed texts, versus the injunction to cement zombie studies to a racialized Caribbean location, usually Haiti, to honor its historical context and resist popular appropriation and commercial exploitation. Since this moves echoes calls to decolonize academic research, which is now prevalent throughout the humanities and social sciences, commentary about the zombies' origins within the wake of Atlantic slavery, and the requisite need for fidelity to or citation of this nightmarish past, can, I think, make a useful contribution to scholarship by providing a focal point to larger methodological and ethical issues for cultural studies overall. To caution against the rightful need for awareness from becoming obscuring obligation, I want to take up Jan Versina's encouragement to disarticulate palimpsest traditions wherein elements may be present, even if residual, within the formation of collective experience and memory, but do not necessarily operate in ways that will enable us to grasp a cultural object's historical trajectory and ongoing dynamics. My fundamental claim today is that the periodic resurgence of zombie figuration isn't primarily a matter of the transgenerational trauma of Atlantic slavery, but that the figure of the zombie in 20th century Haiti largely registers pressures placed upon the Haitian rural population resulting from the social transformations set in motion by the American military occupation of 1915 to 1934. Even past formal occupation, American-led forces degraded aspects of emancipation that had been gained by the formerly enslaved in the revolution and its aftermath. The post-revolutionary Haitian rural populations desire to maintain small freeholds of subsistence and regional market agriculture faced foreign capital's recreation of monocrop production, largely sugar, through waged labor conditions, which also involved periodic reinstatements of corvée labor. Thus, these American-generated confrontations lasted over decades and generations, but were given one form of expression by an emerging peri-urban faction of entrepreneurial religious interests that used innovations of prior cosmological rituals of social reproduction for their own advantage and eventual incorporation within a centralizing state elite's own ambition for authority in the capitalist world system. The cultural object of the modern zombie emerges out of the rise of a para-urban new cadre of professional priests whose source of power derived from a lengthy and expensive initiation, the Onguent Asan, named after the ceremonial rattle, or temple voodoo priests, who commanded a new congregational structure based on individual voluntary association unrelated to kinship, along with elaborate and expensive rituals carried out by female initiates that involved a separation between the roles of performer and spectator. These temple priests introduced innovations that superseded the older para-institutional rural and family-organized voodoo, which had arisen in the late 18th century and consolidated throughout the 19th century. These temple priests, however, brought in new institutional forms of belief amidst massive economic and social upheaval that transformed the life world of rural small land ownership into ones of sharecropping tenancy and turned hinterland rural laborers into migrant labor and consumers of migrant wage remittances. Para-urban temple voodoo worship, led by professionalized priests, provided a transistor space for those who were experiencing the combined and uneven development of deruralization and entry into a national and international slum and urban service life world. but it did so through the production of new emphases on forms of spiritual conflict involving magic, sorcery, and the zombie. Michel Foucault has famously argued for new social arrangements within 19th century Europe involving the rise of apparatuses or dispositifs as the combination of professionalized managers, classificatory knowledges, and a material architecture functioning as a medium for visualizing subjectivity. Similarly, we can speak of a voodoo apparatus becoming manifest in 20th century Haiti, one that transforms zombie folklore into a new cultural object in discourse through the Ongon Asan. The problem with 20th century European anthropologists and ethnographers who largely came to Haiti in the last years and aftermath of American military occupation is that they looked for cultural continuities amongst those who were adapting to rapid social change. To put this in terms of academic disciplines, Haitian voodoo needs to be studied sociologically rather than anthropologically. And the legacy of this misrecognition stands as the decolonizing challenge for us today. In this way, tracking the zombie means going beyond a simple core periphery model that pits a weakly literate Creole-speaking rural nation against an urban French-speaking bourgeois comprador state elite, by adding the intervention of an admittedly small compound of interests involving the interaction between what might be called a para-urban Haitian petty bourgeoisie and a Amero-European academic, artistic, and touristic industry arranging figures, themselves also negotiating spaces between Haitian and American state institutions. From this perspective, the Romero shift becomes intelligible. As a left-wing director, Romero's work is largely set in semi-peripheral Western Pennsylvania, and it persistently criticizes American military imperialism in times of changing social reproduction. Romero's metamorphosis of the Caribbean zombie into the filmic zombie isn't only a consequential legacy of the American military's impositions in Haiti, but also how the social conditions of Romero's regional America resonate more than they differ with earlier conditions in the Caribbean. If Haiti's cul-de-sac plain region is analogous to Pittsburgh's peri-urban locales as they share similar dynamics, this can likewise explain why the figure of the zombie returns periodically in other likewise places throughout the globe, especially those that have also historically experienced American military imposition, such as that region between Seoul and Busan. By the late 19th century, practically no account of Haiti is absent of a mention of voodoo. By the 20th century, and certainly after William Seabrook's 1929 The Magic Island, practically no account of voodoo is absent mention of zombies. Central to this development was the increasing commodification of voodoo and within voodoo in the phase after the onset of the American occupation. A signal intervention with regards to the study of Haitian spiritual culture belongs to anthropologist Melville J. Hershkowitz's argument for the persistence of African culture across the Atlantic through a theory of syncretism and symbolic adaptation. Yet, as Andrew Apter explains, Hershkowitz's claims can now be read as unwittingly reinstating simplifying ideals of ahistorical origin and social homogeneity that mythologize African racial purity over New World miscegenation, as Hershkowitz's continuity but declension model seems to fix culture to race. Yet 20th century anthropologists' own academic disciplinary identities, with their lack of multilingual awareness and deference to colonial administration, often left them unable to grasp that what may have seemed holistically African was itself already a manifestation of prior historical cultural construction and exchange. As Geron de Wolf notes, many African practices seen by anthropologists as authentic and original were already a mixture of largely Portuguese mediated Catholicism and regional African cosmological practices that arose out of their 15th century contact. Rather than look for uninterrupted lineages, we could see the deployment of zombie figurations as better conveyed as a matter of curation and recuration, more than one of more or less accurate and respectful citation. Social subjects relatively reaffirm or fail to endorse prior cultural narratives and symbolic forms based on the pressures and limits of their own time and place, rather than mechanistically repeat the lore or retrospective elements of generic typologies or lineages of social identifications. We might consequently want a zombie studies that is less formulaic and homological and more parametric and analogical. The second half of the 1930s is considered the golden age of Anglophone Haitian ethnography, exemplified by Herskovits, George Eden Simpson, Catherine Dunham, Zora Neale Hurston, Harold Corlander, and Alan Lomax, who often overlapped each other on short visits to the island. Because voodoo ceremonies were prescribed during the American occupation, however, American and European ethnographers only had access to these rituals within the affordances granted by American military personnel and their locally trained Haitian forces. Melville Herskowitz's Life in the Haitian Valley, 1937, stands as an urtext for post-sensationalist, post-Seabrook accounts of voodoo, but Karen Ramsey details how Herskowitz relied on his ability to leverage military permissions for the staging of ceremonies absent of sacrifices. Perception of voodoo for the Americans ran through the army and the police, as Alan Lomax explains that the best way to keep up with the voodoo ceremonies is to make friends with a local police sergeant who used the official prohibitions as a means of lining their own purses. With an introduction from the local police, assumably after a bribe, Lomax says that Haitians then had carte blanche to perform voodoo ceremonies for him to record. Whereas ritual practices had either been banned or tacitly allowed by the American military and set back by Catholic Church anti-voodoo campaigns in the 1940s, a version of voodoo had been moved to the mainstream by the late 1940s and 50s, which are considered the golden age of Haitian tourism. While Americans and Europeans had been previously reluctant to visit Haiti, a tourism apparatus emerged from economic growth and built upon the grounds of new social liberalism seen with women's suffrage, infrastructure projects, and hotel development, and the limited development of an indigenous tourism business class after the 1949-1950 bicentennial International Exposition at Port-au-Prince. Voodoo was now positioned as a central element for foreign consumption, as the feature that would set Haiti apart in the Caribbean competition for tourists, and it was increasingly advertised as the raison d'etre for visits. The 1956 Haitian Government Tourist Bureau admitted that all tourists visiting Haiti want to see a voodoo ceremony or dance, which can be seen nowhere else on Earth. The Standard Guide to Mexico and Caribbean's 1956-57 edition advertised, if you're only spending a few days in Haiti, be sure to include a Saturday night so you don't miss the voodoo and night clubbing, two major attractions. The mechanism for voodoo's transmogrification from prohibition and tacit illegality to its globalizing dissemination in the 1950s was its packaging as an institutionalizing discourse by a complex of Amero-European academic and popular press ethnographers and emerging Haitian interests, ranging from temple voodoo practitioners to statist officials. This discourse, however, was generated from a narrow domain of observation and often by interlinked individuals whose recursive reports created something like a collective confirmation bias or doxa of explanation. It is from this field that arose the cultural object of the modern zombie. McGee notes that most scholarship about Haitian voodoo has in fact been about the Afro-Haitian religion practices of the Haitian South, generally speaking from the area below the Plateau Central. This encompasses both the capital city of Port-au-Prince and its surrounding environments. Yet as Herskovits in the 1930s, Simpson in the 40s, and Darren in the 50s acknowledged these regions' practices were not easily duplicated elsewhere in Haiti. Catholic missionary Jean Cabal in the 1950s had estimated that only 15% of Haitians lived in the regions where what has now been canonized as normative voodoo was in fact practiced. While the anthropological gaze looked at this terrain to declare the presence of continuities back to the Middle Passage. It, however, was a region undergoing structural transformation that was altering social conditions that had been created after the revolution and which had endured until the American invasion, which began to change it. If both peer-reviewed scholarly publication and popular press accounts use this region as a synecdoche for Haitian culture and voodoo overall, a similar condensation appears with self-reinforcing networks of American and European researchers who were dependent upon a bivalve articulation between a relatively small band of local Amero-European introducers and their favored Haitian informants, relied upon for their unusual receptivity to foreign observers. After help from priest Mars, Herscovitz's fieldwork in Haiti created an operational map for his students and advisors like Simpson, Dunham, Hurston, and Lomax, who would become a mutually reliant network in various degrees of collegiality and competition. Yet underneath Herscovitz's aura, decades of Anglophone researchers made visits to Doc Stanley Henry Reeser, considered the first white American practitioner of voodoo and someone with a wide realm of voodoo acquaintances and informances. European researchers had slightly different but often interweaving prefabricated channels. Odette Menesson-Regaud, the white French photographer and wife to Milo Regaud, the Black Haitian Bureau of Ethnography researcher on voodoo, was described by Harold Kurlander as the ultimate insider, the outstanding non-Haitian. She knew everybody. She was the best informed of all researchers and scholars. And according to Erica Bourgeois, Menesson-Regaud presented herself as the island's official guide for voodoo, acting as the go-between for Alfred Métraux, Maya Deren, Bourgeois, and others to meet temple voodoo priests, often taking researchers to the same individuals over time. Métraux's 1959 Voodoo in Haiti, perhaps one of the most influential studies on voodoo after Herskovitz, is in fact dedicated to Menesson-Regaud and to Lugina Delorge, a pseudonym, the Mambo of La Saline that Menesson-Regaud introduced to Métraux. The informants that Menesson-Regaud returned to were ones that were especially welcoming to white Europeans and their gaze and urban Haitians. Longina was a Mambo in particular who was willing to talk and teach voodoo to the unfamiliar in ways that has left a strong lineage and legacy for Western viewers and researchers. Longina maintained contact and influence within the 1949 founded National Folklore Dance Troupe that was a primary institution in this phase for visualizing voodoo culture to Americans. In 1951, Mama Lolo, who was a dancer in this troupe, trained by Longina, would become the central figure for Catherine Brown's influential 1978 eponymous study of voodoo in New York, and she had been recruited as a singer for the troupe. Brown's students like Ramsey and Richmond are also now key figures in North American Haitian studies, thus creating a relatively uninterrupted epistemological lineage from Longina. The Anglophone lineage of knowledge on voodoo similarly depends upon a limited set of testimonial ongoing. Chief among them is the only named, that is to say non-pseudonymous figure assumed to be a Bocour and zombie maker, a Carrefour de Fort Ongan T. Cuisine, who is mentioned in practically, these are the books that specifically talk about him, he's the most discussed Haitian priest in the Anglophone tradition, going all the way back when he's mentioned in the notebook appendix to Seabrook's Magic Island as the famous Léogán Papaloy, who compares his magical skills against his father's, one of the great Ougans of the past generation. A longer account of Tikuzan comes in Dunham's Island Possessed, where he's the focus of an entire chapter, as Dunham travels to meet a feared figure who is believed to have zombified his 7 wives. Dunham goes to Léogán, believing, however, that Tikuzan is simply a peasant, somewhat educated, and shrewd enough to use divining powers, extrasensory perception, and mother wit to elevate himself to the position of an important landowner, a capitalist, and Haitian peasantry terms. Tikunsan appears in nearly every other major account of voodoo, and near his death in 1957, the Haiti Sun, the main English language newspaper, ran a front page story on him as one of Haiti's most famous voodoo priests and a household name in Haitian religion. Given the outsized role of Tikunsan, frequently reported as being a Bokor, and Lorgina, who Metro carefully documents as having a very profitable sideline in selling magic, what are we to make of the relationship between increasing wealth, land ownership, and zombies in the peri-urban region, the island semi-periphery that is neither the rural hinterland nor the urban metropolis of Port-au-Prince? The constricted and recursive nature of the anthropological field leads, however, to regional differences being taken as universal national ones. The focus on the cul-de-sac de Port-au-Prince domain overemphasizes a region that has, as Menesal-Regal claimed, a greater presence of its population descended from the Congo enslavement cache rather than the Dahomey one, in ways that may foreground petrolaws associated with Congo cosmology more than the Rada ones associated with Dahomey. It's conventional to characterize the Rada laws as more indigenous to Africa and genial in tone, while the Petro are presented as more shaped by the Caribbean experience of slavery and the more explosive, vengeful, and requiring more animal sacrifices. Yet rural Vaudouisants, who were the vast majority of Haitians, did not strongly distinguish between Rada and Petro distinctions, so much as they made the separation between Jinnin as a spiritual practice and magic as a sorcery. Unlike Jinnin, which is voodoo seen as strengthening collective embedment over generations, magic is associated with money, individual gain, and a profit-seeking commodity economy. Furthermore, magic is conducted by voodoo priests who also decide to act as sorcerers, or boko, in ways associated with the production of zombies. Here, though, regional differences matter, as even by the 1920s, Blair Niles recounts that bokors exist far more commonly in the cul-de-sac region around Port-au-Prince than elsewhere in Haiti. The explanation for the production of 20th century sorcery, I think, best comes from Gerald Murray's argument that generational patterns of social reproduction were undergoing changes, as small landowners were increasingly selling land, often in ways that these farmers were reluctant to make public. Murray explains that families were giving away ownership of property that had, in some cases, dated back to the post-revolutionary era as a legacy of revolutionary emancipation. In the immediate wake of the revolution, Haiti's departments had substantially different governments and agricultural arrangements. Unlike the North, where Henri Christophe sought to reinstate plantation-like sugar production through a state-driven corvée model of production, the West, under Pétion and Boyer, liberalized land ownership in ways that created small freeholds, producing subsistent agriculture for regional markets and some coffee for international trade. While this system would eventually dominate Haiti as a whole after the collapse of the 1826 Rural Code, the West Department, including Port-au-Prince, its peri-urbans, and the rural plain, would have a greater memory of the revolution's immediate effects as manifested through land reforms, which included prohibitions against foreign land ownership and any effort to direct Haiti towards inclusion in the world market. Cosmological voodoo practices developed through the small freehold economy that links family-based loa with small freehold property as héritage or heritage, in a process where an ancestor buried on family-owned land eventually became part of the family's loa pantheon, an eventual member of a broader spiritual nation. Voodoo in the rural freeholds was thus family-based, or domestic, as Metral was first to label it, and its major focal themes are the ritual, contacting, and appeasement of ancestral spirits. That is to say, family spirits. Kinship groups organized their own rituals and only called on itinerant priests for extra help when necessary. These were the ongan mako, literally basket ugan, a designation which probably comes from the shoulder basket which they placed their various paraphernalia as they walked up and down the plain, where voodoo practices were mainly directed to instances of sickness, death, healing, and burial, and magical practices were feared sidelines that were more or less prohibited. For Murray, these practices consolidated after the revolution and indicate less an African derivation of so many elements, but a peasantized focus in both theology and ritual as the rural population adopted its religion, that's to say pre-revolutionary religion, to the realities of its post-revolutionary daily life. In contrast to the traditional rural priests, Murray pointed to the rise of a different kind of priest, the Onguent Ensan, the temple voodoo priest, named after the ceremonial rattle for services that can be used only after an initiation, a priest who has acquired powers through purchase and special initiation rites, traffics more heavily with a more violent lua, and is generally quite expensive in his services. These temple priests shifted voodoo from the para-institutional practice run by families and itinerant priests to a more institutionalized para-urban practice with its own ceremonial architecture in temples and ritual apparatus, and something like a price-setting marketplace as they introduced cost differences amongst each other for their services. The Onguent Ensan increasingly then monopolized the ability to communicate with and be possessed by the spirits as they presented themselves as necessary mediators in contrast to the more democratized domestic and rural practices. The Onguent Ensan also recurated aspects of 19th century voodoo by effectively creating new and increasingly expensive rituals like infant blessings or funerary practices, introducing social hierarchies through purchased levels of initiation like the lava-tete or the kanzo fire ceremony, and the creation of temple female acolytes, the onzi. Thanks to the transformations led by the temple priests, women were then, in the 20th century, increasingly shunted from having oracular authority of speaking and interpretation into being the wordless vessels of spirit possession. Richmond suggests that these hosi, which often came from the wealthier families, were increasingly chosen for physical beauty standards, especially as temple practice involved more spectacular physical displays of possession than was the case with rural practices, which often emphasized visions rather than possessions. Richmond notes the increasing resentment by an older generation of Haitians at their disenfranchisement from spiritual contact and the rise of manipulative fraud by the Onguent Ensan for their own enrichment. The Onguent Ensan's assumption of authority over life passage rituals meant that families increasingly had financial burdens placed upon them to maintain communal expectations. Much like the more recent North American commercialization of social reproduction rituals like birth ceremonies, coming of age, wedding, and funeral services that now routinely inject debt-creating pressures on American families, the same was true in Haiti. Thus, Murray argues that voodoo-driven land transfers created internal stratifications within small farming communities, as the costs of these rituals resulted in freeholders selling off parcels of their land, doing away with what the revolution had providing with them, but the families staying on the land as sharecropping tenants. This process of obscured transformations meant family members weren't immediately displaced from the family and often continued to speak of themselves as the owners, but in fact were tenants, even while the land was being consolidated, often by Haitian rural land monopolizers who would in turn operate as surrogates for the introduction of Western capitalist monocrop interests. Over time, though, sharecropping couldn't support a rural population that was increasing on increasingly smaller freehold acreage, leading to urban immigration or itinerant wage labor in the Dominican Republic, elsewhere in the Caribbean, or especially the United States. As Lowenthal writes in 78, the economic aspects of voodoo led to the concentration of cash in the hands of ritual specialists and the subsequent reinvestment of this immense capital to underwrite the steadily increasing flow of rural Haitian immigrants in search of labor opportunities throughout the Caribbean and North America. Murray's comments on the 70s and Richmond's on the 1980s indicate changes, however, that were already occurring in the 1930s and 40s, albeit without an explicit analytical awareness of their events by the anthropologists, largely American anthropologists and ethnographers anxious to record voodoo practices lest they disappear under state prohibitions and campaigns by the Catholic Church. Yet what the anthropologists did not perceive was that voodoo was undergoing internal transformations and rearrangements. And what the anthropologists were recording was itself a recently modernized version of voodoo, one presented to Europeans by those most welcoming and amenable to outside observation. When American and European ethnographers were invited to watch ceremonies, which they often paid for, they were led to believe that non-Haitians had never seen them before. But what these foreign watchers didn't realize is that, in fact, these rituals were of relatively new provenance and were innovations by a relatively new faction of temple priests who were responding to and profiting from the degradation of the rural life world of small freehold farming. The ethnographers then returned the favor by canonizing what they saw in the field. The modernity of this practice is explicit with its promulgation of the problem concept of zombies. As a product of the convergence of land-labor transformations and the articulation of the Onguan, Onsan, and foreign ethnographers, the figure of the zombie functions differently from what Michael Tausig claimed was the cause for devil discourse among Bolivian miners. Tausig argued that these neophyte proletarians registered the trauma of transition from a peasant mode of production to the everyday experience of wage labor under capitalist conditions. But rumors of zombie magic do not emerge, though, from direct experience of wage labor in Haiti, but instead emerge from the longer commodity chain involving Haiti's reincorporation into the capitalist world system. If magic emerges in the countryside to explain the unconventional rise in wealth, the Onguan Osan recreated folkloric tales as an entrepreneurial means of enriching and empower themselves by acting as the mediators between deruralizing Haitians, Haitian metropolitan elites, Amero-European ethnographers, and a nascent tourist industry. While anthropology's native informants often have their cultural experiences appropriated for the purposes of epistemological extraction and possession for social science, the Onguan Asan, however, collectively learned their own agency and learned how to curate Haitian folklore and spirituality as a means of gaining empowerment with regards capitalist encroachments by transforming popular experience into a consumable discourse for outsiders. If cultural mediators like Rieser and Menassar-Regan channeled foreigners to welcome the Onguan Osan, these temple priests also functioned as a channel for peri-urban Haitians to gain employment within a growing Port-au-Prince as servants or voodoo practitioners for hotel and club-based performances. This influence wasn't simply unidirectional, as many dancers, musicians, and priest leaders of stage ceremonies in the capital city learned theatrical skills and techniques created to impress tourists, but then brought them back for use in their own para-urban temples. If ethnographers and anthropologists unwittingly recorded the presence of social tensions and transformations, sometimes by interviewing individuals who themselves had made the transition from rural to temple-based practices, these changes were set in motion by the large-scale reconfigurations of Haiti that were initiated by the American military occupation even before the arrival of the anthropologists. Desiring to establish sugar crop monocrop production, the American government sought to conglomerate land holdings in ways that catalyzed the turn towards sharecropping and itinerant labor elsewhere in the Caribbean. Americans then built highways to transport agricultural goods for export and used the reinstallation of the hated corvée. And lastly, but perhaps most importantly, Americans disregarded caste-like status hierarchies dating back to the 18th century. While German and French factors would often marry Haitians, partially to get around regulations against foreign ownership, the Americans wouldn't. And in fact, the Americans brought an extreme version of their binary racial codes, as the U.S. Marines in the occupation were disproportionately staffed by men in the American South and brought Southern racism to Haiti. Americans' unvarnished racism profoundly shocked, however, Haitian elites who were horrified to discover that the American military occupiers made no distinction between urban French-speaking elites and rural, weakly literate, and usually darker-skinned ones. Just as the Haitian Revolution changed course when the mixed race factions began to align themselves with the Black slave revolts, the American military occupation resulted in a similar alliance. Haitian academic, artistic, and eventually political elites began constructing a symbolic alliance with the countryside through a cultural endorsement of voodoo as central to Haitian identity, as seen with Jean Price-Mar's iconic 1928 "So Spoke the Uncle." Key to this cultural alignment, in fact, you could say the marriage brokers between a rural population previously disregarded by the urban metropolitan elites, were the Onguent Ensemble, who bound Haitian experience at both ends of the class spectrum with Amero-European academic knowledge in ways that eventually congealed to support statist interests, capitalist architecture, and nascent tourist economies. In this way, the zombie arose as the result of the American invasion's long spiral. For magic and the zombie was the symbolic figure that the Onguent Ensemble deployed to respond, on one hand, to the needs of deruralizing local Haitians and their own crisis of employment, and on the other, the search by Haitian educated elites for usable elements to craft as unique national characteristics, even if these were sensationalized by commerce. To paraphrase Price-Mars, if voodoo was central to Haitian identity, then the zombie was central to the creation of the post-occupation state. The zombie in the 20th century then originates more from the voodoo dispositif than traumatic projections of Atlantic slavery. As Laybourne claims, when Pétion came to power, the common folk of southern Haiti were serfs with a memory of slavery. When he died, they were peasants. The American occupation, however, challenged and disrupted this rural society in ways that reconfigured the voodoo that had developed within it and amplified fears of sorcery beyond their function and routine appearance, or actually rare appearance, before 1915. While zombie folklore appeared as a means of calibrating the rise of social inequality as a way of explaining wealth production amongst those who ought to have been equal, the post-invasion zombie becomes recurated to respond to the American reconfiguration of Haiti overall. Since the zombie arises from the conjunction of militarized imperialism and combined and uneven development, altering semi-peripheral relations of social reproduction, the later Romero shift is legible as responding to analogous pressures, as Romero's cannibal zombies shown in the cinema space also registers the breakdown of community in deindustrializing Western Pennsylvania. Rather than stand as an instance of cultural appropriation, the Romero zombie can be seen as evidence of the translatability of similar dynamics in early 20th century Haiti from conditions that were themselves ultimately American in origination. The future of zombie studies then may rest in charting the uprising of similar dynamics elsewhere in the capitalist world system. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.